Welcome to the Leadership Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Diamond Arnold, Director of Leadership Solutions that Inspire Software. I am also a leadership coach, leadership consultant, and author, and host of the Leadership Genius Podcast, your resource for everything leadership, where we talk about all kinds of subjects related to leadership in a professional capacity, social capacity, within your families, within your communities, and particularly in the workplace. And today's focus topic is based on an article that I've recently published for Inspire Software called Why Strategy Execution Fails and How to Turn Strategy into Results. We've talked a lot about strategy and how to execute strategy over the past several podcasts because it is one of the biggest business challenges, not only currently, but for quite a while. And it's interesting, even as we progress with AI and we progress with technology and people move their strategy into platforms and softwares like Inspire Software and other platforms like goal setting software, people still struggle with it. It's one thing to set strategy, it's a different thing to execute it. So, what do we mean by strategy execution? So, I just want to say that up front. In one of the sort of the seminal pieces on strategy and strategy execution is John Doerr's book, Measure What Matters. And in Measure What Matters, early in the book, Doerr has this really interesting quote that captures us. And I think all of us deal with this in many different ways throughout the organization, no matter what our role is. The ideas are easy, execution is everything. So we have a lot of ideas, we have plans, we have strategies that we put into place. It's the execution of that strategy that is the challenging part. And what happens, it's a little bit like the Mike Tyson quote, the really famous Mike Tyson quote is that everyone's got a plan. Everyone's got a strategy when they get into the ring with him in his days when he was at his peak as a champion. But what happens once you get punched? What happens once you set the strategy, you launch it? It's the beginning of the year. We just finished out the first quarter of 2026, and what are we doing to make the adjustments now? The execution part is the toughest part. It's often not about how well the strategy is. It's just, do you have the system? Do you have the process? Do you have the goal setting methodology? Do you have the leadership at every level of the organization that is prepared to execute that strategy at a high level? So, one of the things that we recently did last year is Inspire did our own original research, and I'll create a link to that research on the state of strategy in 2025. And some of the things that we learned from that research is that there are three fundamental ways that strategy breaks once you've implemented and put it into sort of into the ethosphere, the ecosystem of a company. Is that one is the execution has a visibility gap. And we write about this in the article that I just posted. Leaders lack real-time visibility into what's happening with the strategy. We know what the target is, but we lack visibility into how well we're achieving the target unless we're like looking at very specific numbers like revenue or cost savings, which is part of the strategy. But if your strategy is only about revenue, then you're missing a lot of other factors for your organization. So one is the execution visibility gap. The alignment drift is another. So, alignment, once you set the strategy, how do you create alignment to that strategy throughout the organization? And it's complicated because people in different departments are measuring different things, and there may or may not be a direct alignment to that corporate level strategy. And so people really struggle with what we call alignment drift. And then the third, and I think the biggest, this is where really I'm going to focus the rest of the podcast on, is the performance disconnect. What happens in a lot of organizations that we work with that is clear in the research is that once the strategy is set, how is that strategy operationalized? Now, in my post, they had this quote from Ken Blanchard, who I remember him often talking about this when I worked with Ken and his team at Blanchard, was that once a strategy is set, it's the leader's job, the executive leader's jobs to turn that strategy, the hierarchy pyramid upside down and allow the organization to implement that strategy from the bottom up. And what happens is a lot of organizations struggle with how to do that. We believe that what we've discovered at Inspire is that strategy left alone just at the strategy level and not turned into performance, strategy lives in a vacuum. The other side is true too, is when you have a performance management system, whether it's annual performance reviews, you've moved to more quarterly performance reviews, or like in Doer's book, Measure What Matters, one of the chapters talks about how Adobe and other companies have just completely ditched performance management. When you have any type of performance that's not aligned or connected to the strategy, performance lives in a vacuum. So here's two major problems. You have strategy being set and not aligned to performance, or performance agreements being made and performance being pursued, but not aligned or connected to strategy. And that creates this huge gap in organizations in understanding how the company is actually executing strategy and what does the performance really mean? Like, how are you evaluating performance if you're not aligned to the strategy, the vision, the values of the company? So, just a couple of things that turned up in our research. One thing that we saw was that 32% of organizations report high performance in executing strategy. Only 32% linked high performance to the execution of strategy. So, what's happening to the other 70%, almost 70%? When you're executing strategy. So there's a real disconnect between organizations reporting high levels of performance in relation to the execution of strategy. This is where it's really interesting. More than 58% of leaders are dissatisfied with their execution effectiveness. That's almost 6 out of 10 leaders are not satisfied with how effective either their teams, their company, their organization, their departments are executing on the strategy. Over 70% of the leaders that we surveyed said that dashboards fail to provide timely and actionable insights. So they're looking at dashboards. This is the era of data, big data, people analytics, business analytics. 70%, 7 out of 10 leaders say that their dashboards don't give them any insights into what's happening, particularly as it relates to performance. And then only 19% of leaders feel highly confident in their data visualization tools. So whatever dashboards they're using in terms of key performance indicators or metrics, they're not highly confident. Most leaders are, less than 20% of leaders are actually confident in the data that they're looking at. And so that really sets me up at the heart of what I wanted to talk about from this article that I posted. There's a lot of other things that we cover in the article, but we've been talking about this for a while at Inspire Software, is that in an era of big data, we want to challenge you to not only what are you looking at in terms of the data, but how are you cultivating data? And we've identified gap, what we call gap between what we call cold data and warm data. Cold data is the data that includes traditional dashboards like KP performance metrics, revenue outcomes. The cold data is the numbers that you can see, like the quantitative data that you put in towards a goal. Say we're going to achieve this number by this time. That's the quantitative. What's often missing is what we call warm data is the story or the why behind what the numbers actually are. And that usually happens, that data is cultivated, or in many cases not cultivated in today's organizations, through one-to-one conversations, feedback, recognition of employees, leadership insights, individual insights, insights from performance appraisals, insights from team meetings that may be running 4 disciplines of execution from Covey. Where is the data being created around creating the narrative or the story around what the strategy is? So in other words, we have cold data and we often get those numbers, but we don't have a lot of insight into what those numbers mean unless we are intentionally creating conversations, recording feedback, asking for feedback, capturing the data that tells the story behind what the numbers are. And one of the most significant ways to produce that type of data is through continuous performance management. That is regular check-ins, one-to-one check-ins with your manager and having conversations around those goals, asking for feedback on it, managers recognizing individual contributors' contributions or team contributions to it. It's team leaders being able to not only look at the numbers and give task updates on what everybody's working on during the week, but also how's the process going towards this goal? What is the team learning? What process adjustments does the team need to make? Are you capturing those conversations? Are you recognizing consistent challenges with clients and maybe in your product? Are there regular conversations around that that then can be cultivated, mined, analyzed, and be able to create some type of narrative around how this performance relates to the strategy? So there's a big gap between cold data and warm data, and effective strategy execution fundamentally requires the integration of both forms of data. And it takes the cultivation of both forms of data, not just the quantitative data. You combine the measurable performance signals with the continuous leadership conversations, whatever leadership language your organization is using, that bring context and meaning and direction to the information that then feeds up to the executive level leadership and gives them insights into the strategy, what they might need to adjust in the next quarter, what they might need to adjust moving into the next strategy cycle that they go through, whether it's annual, a 3-year strategy, whatever strategy format you're using. It gives executives insight into it. The other thing that the warm data does for individual contributors is, in our research and a lot of research that's out there, is that we see engagement levels go up. We see productivity go up with employees. And the fundamental truth behind that is when team members, team leaders, individual contributors understand how their work is aligning to the strategy, there's so many benefits that happen on a positive level for employees and the people performing towards the strategy that come out of having these regular check-ins and one-to-ones. So I think the big takeaway in the article that we published this month is, what are you doing? What is your organization doing to close the gap between the strategy that you set at the beginning of the year, say, and what is your assessment of it now? What information are you using to assess where the company is right now? What data are you using to be able to make informed decisions about how you will pivot moving forward during the rest of the year? This is one of the major leadership challenges at any level. Years, they break it down year by year and say, here's the major things that we're going to try to accomplish. How do they know? Like, this is still a big gap between executing your strategy, either in a professional environment, a social environment, in your home, you know, whether it's economic strategy or the vision and values of your family. What are the gaps? How do you know that you're effectively executing strategy? So that's the topic of this month's article. And really, the focus of it is, what kind of information are you using to make the adjustments that you need to make to be as effective of a leader as possible? And it's really the premise of the Leadership Genius podcast. The core of our message is the world's in desperate need of more effective leadership. We need to create a world full of leadership geniuses. And the idea of a leadership genius is taking our collective knowledge, wisdom, and experience and putting it into application, into action, and turning strategy into actual results over the long term. Thank you for joining the Leadership Podcast. If you got any value out of this, please like and subscribe. If you want more information on how we do this with companies, please visit inspiresoftware.com. I'll provide the link in the description. And I wish you the best on your journey in making the world a better place through effective leadership here at the Leadership Genius podcast.